Thanks everyone for joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US. We're going to get started on our webinar, The Public Review of the XBRL US Style Guide. Our speakers today are Scott Tice. Scott is chair of the XBRL US Domain Steering Committee, and he's also CEO of NovaWorks. And we also have Campbell Pride, president and CEO of XBRL US. As we go through the program, if you have any technical difficulties, please email us at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, @xbrl.us. And if you have questions through the program, please submit them through the Q&A link that you see on your online console. And we'll take questions through the program. Everyone is muted except for the speakers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Campbell Pride.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks everyone for joining. So today we're going to go through the public review of the XBRL US Style Guide. And just wanted to start with just making the point that there are a number of important benefits from standards, and that they streamline the processing and reduce unnecessary costs with everyone effectively recreating data structures. So, in order to implement those successfully, we need high quality taxonomies that are complete, consistent, and logically structured and meet the needs of all stakeholders. So it's part of this initiative to get better taxonomies, not just taxonomies related to SEC reporting, but any taxonomy that is used in the US, and there are a number of them. We thought it was important to make sure that there were a consistent style guide, a consistent style was adopted in developing this taxonomy, so it makes it easier to develop those taxonomies whenever you may use them. And this applies to anyone who wants to collect data and they want to use XBRL to do it. The style guide is an important resource to do it. XBRL US itself has established a number of goals which fit into this. And first is to establish data quality and consistency standards for SEC filings, but then for all filings as well. Eliminate barriers to XBRL data use, expand XBRL use across the entire US economy, and establish a sustainable business model for the development of these standards. So on that, I think one of the things in terms of establishing data quality is really critical, and a lot of that starts with having a very good design and making the taxonomy that's being used very clear and easy for users of that taxonomy to understand. So over the past year and a half, we've been working on these objectives of raising quality through the creation of things like the Data Quality Committee, which you may have heard of, but we've also been working on standards, which has been led by Scott on the Domain Steering Committee, and a lot of the work comes into play in terms of developing better taxonomies and standards. So just to give you an overview of the Domain Steering Committee, it's a volunteer organization, and the slide shows that who are the members of the DSC. So this group over the past year and a half has been developing the XBRL US taxonomy review and certification process, which include a series of documents to help stakeholders build better and successful taxonomies. Along with these reference materials, we're establishing a certification process to confirm that a taxonomy meets the appropriate criteria to produce good quality XBRL data. So this is critical given the increased demand for XBRL that we're seeing in numerous new reporting domains, including insurance and surety, with the work and process taxonomy, which has been successfully incorporated into the internal financial systems of large insurance companies, and also the solar financing taxonomy, which is also covers project finance and the data that you would usually that an investor is going to need to invest in a solar installation. And they're just two examples, but making sure that all these taxonomies developed within the US are consistent and interchangeable and components can be used between them. It's important that we're all developing these things along the same standard process. So the public review, for example, the solar taxonomy is set for the summer, and there are also plans to build taxonomies for reporting by utilities, CAFA reporting for municipalities, and with proposed legislation that's on the agenda, there could be a much greater demand for many more taxonomies for reporting financial data in a number of domains. So the DSC mission is to support technology and development efforts of XBRL US necessary to meet business reporting needs of key markets in the United States. So this includes approving taxonomy development work, performing quality control, and providing feedback to working groups. But these standards could also be used by anyone who's developing an internal taxonomy. We have companies who want to use XBRL internally. These standards can be used in these cases too. These standards are free and open, and anyone can use them. So last week we kicked off a public review for the style guide, which is a critical piece of the taxonomy development process. And we applaud the diligent work of the Domain Steering Committee and encourage XBRL members to get involved in the committee. But we also encourage everyone, members and non-members alike, to review this document, provide comments on the style guide, and that'll set the standard for years to come. So with that, I'll hand it over to Scott.
Thanks, Campbell. First, I want to thank everyone for giving me the chance to do this. We've been working hard on this for the past year and a half, and we're really excited about pushing this process forward and really trying to achieve the goal of having XBRL be used for carrying not only data, but what the data means across various frontiers, whether they be from industry sectors to regulators or NGOs, et cetera. So that's kind of the underlying thing that we're really shooting for with this. So I'm going to go through the process of what we've been doing. Basically, what we've been working on right now is creating a taxonomy development toolkit, which will include pretty much three things. There's two things on the slide here, but a taxonomy guide or development guide and a style guide. It came about early on as we were reviewing this that certain things that have been done in the past that I hate to use the word abandoned, but because of the progression of developing UGT and other things never really achieved full fruition, that we felt that we needed to come back and readdress those and finish them up, which is where we come up with the style guide. So what we did is we established a certification process in the last year, and we have certified or approved one taxonomy, that being the work in process taxonomy. And that was done through the process of creating metrics. It's about 6 or 7 pages of bullet points that basically say that we want to see taxonomies have the certain components, certain characteristics, things that we feel that will make it a successful taxonomy, and that to try and minimize issues for preparers, for consumers, no matter what the venue happens to be, whether it's extremely complicated like and expansive like UGT or very simple. That there's some basic things that we want to see in there. And that includes documentation, not just the taxonomy, but how it's documented, how people are going to expect to be able to use it, and how it's governed. And we're working on individual taxonomies. We've done the work in process. Solar's in process. The Domain Steering Committee right now is in a monitoring role, and Campbell has been working closely with that. And kind of in the long run here, what we're looking for in the approval process is that the DSC is aware of what's going on, that we help and provide advice as necessary. And at some point, we go through the process of actually seeing if it meets the metrics for what we feel is a well-formed taxonomy. So a little bit of background first. As I mentioned before, when we started creating this guide, it became clear that we needed to have consistency. And then apparently there was already a document that did that, and it was pretty well drafted, very oriented towards GAAP, which is not a problem, except that we're trying to open XBRL up across the board for carrying business information. So one of the things, and we'll show this in the slide later, we did is we try to stratify this. So we have basically a base style guide and then other documentation that is used for individual taxonomies. So this draft guide was created, but not ratified in 2007. A lot of people put a lot of work into that. And there's been other efforts, I think, done across the board around the world to deal with these problems, because certainly they come up on a pretty regular basis as you're trying to put together any type of taxonomy, even if it's not XBRL. I know as a software developer, as I'm going through building large, complex code, that naming just routines that are part of the software can be challenging at times because there's so many things. When you start getting into hundreds of thousands or millions of lines of code, organization becomes paramount. And the same thing is true with XBRL. So, naming is really very important, and that's what the style guide's really about. So the draft content, again, was largely US GAAP driven. And one of the things we've done here is we've actually sanitized or tried to draw a bright line between GAAP and what GAAP is then based on, which is the style guide. So our first draft was reviewed in late 2016, and basically we created that by lifting the original and then added new sections, and also tried to be clear about what are rules versus basically non-normative, which essentially means this is stuff that we're talking about but isn't necessarily a rule. If it's non-normative, normative would be a rule. And that was approved a few weeks ago, and has been placed up on the website for people to take a look at. So what is this all about? Basically, the goal is to facilitate the creation of consistent, high-quality, easy-to-use taxonomies by serving as a basis for naming styles of XBRL concepts, labels, and other components. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it really comes down to how do you take each of the pieces and name both the concepts and the labels that are associated with them, and then even to that point, what's in the documentation for that. What's this applicable to? Well, basically for the development and, and architecture of all taxonomies, for open and extendable taxonomies created and used in the United States. And by the way, we hope this is a good enough idea in other places around the world. Please steal liberally. And if you've got things to apply to our stuff, we want to hear it too. What it's not, and I do want to make this point about this, this is not a replacement or an update to UGT. And we're basically laying down what we feel are the base things that are going to apply to taxonomies going forward. We hope that as we go through the process of marketing this, that other organizations and groups that are already following part of it will adopt more and more of it over time. And that'll really help out with consistency. So it's not a mandate to update existing taxonomies. And it's not meant to dictate industry-specific terms or requirements, only to guide consistency expressing such terms. And you can see that right away when you start looking at terms of art and accounting that are very specific, like net and total and other, and how that applies in other areas of business. It may not be exactly the same. So those types of things, we're not necessarily dictate that, but what we want to have is when somebody creates a taxonomy, that the terminology is used is consistent, and that you follow the certain rules that keep you out of falling into certain potholes that may cause problems down the road. So what we're going to do now is we're going to overview what's in the style guide and take a look at it, so to give you a roadmap as you're looking at this to say, hey, what are these components and what may apply to me, or how can I contribute to this process? So basically there's two parts to this. The first is, what's this all about, which is section 1 and 2. And then we have the rules, and that goes 3 to 7. That covers basic language things, concept names, also known as elements, labels, and then documentation, which of course is another label rule, and then the use of references. Let me just quickly pop over here. So the PDF version of the style guide is available on the XBRL US website, along with the comment process, and we'll talk about this in a bit. And in the style guide itself here in PDF, you'll see the table of contents, and then each of these sections. So what we would like people to go through this and point out, if there's deficiencies or things that we should talk about, or that you feel are too restrictive, or maybe we missed something, to add those types of things in, and those are the things we'll be looking for in the comments. So let's take a little bit more of a look inside of each of these sections. So in the introduction, we're really talking about the scope, the goals, the terminology, the placement of this document in the scheme of other documents. I felt chairing this committee that it was really important to understand the overall architecture of the library of information that people rely upon. So when you're building anything, I have a go-to point where I can pick up documents and find the reference information that I need. And I understand when I'm looking at a document, this is particularly true for us who are involved in the governance of certain of these documents, that we know where they lie. So in the grand scheme of things, and this is covered in this style guide, this is part of or sits on the foundation of documents from XBRL International, like XBRL 2.1 specification, etc., which then sits on top of the XML specifications. Now, as a normal developer or user of XBRL, you may not actually care about this stuff. In fact, in my experience early on with this, I found that for most users for XBRL, the 2.1 specification was wonderful if you're a nerd like I am, but wow, if you don't know a lot about this, you're just going to be overwhelmed by it. And actually, in terms of what makes a good taxonomy, parts of that apply, but a lot of other parts don't. So the style guide sits on top of this and talks about how certain aspects of what is done with XBRL should be named. And that's the key thing. This is mostly about naming. And then above that, depending on which organizations you are and what we're working with, you have supplemental documents, such as a supplemental style guide or taxonomy specification or guides. For more complex taxonomies, you're going to be looking at preparers guides and users guides. What we did with WIP is we combined that into one, basically a taxonomy user guide for both consumers and preparers. In some cases, this may be very sparse. In other cases, it may have quite a bit of information. And today, there's lots of documentation that exists that fits in these slots. Some of them don't fit nicely. Some of them do. And going forward, I would just encourage all organizations that are involved with this stuff to, to try and follow a particular model. And if we can agree on that as a group in the long run, that'll help any outsider coming in have a better chance of quickly understanding what they need to know to work with the documents or to help create things. So part two, we really moved into data organization. And you'll see that it's actually fairly short, because what we want to do is just talk about in the taxonomy creation process how the naming and affects the organization is related to the semantic model. So if you figure out, here's the data I want to represent, here's my functional requirements, I start naming things. If I'm going to have dimensions or type dimensions and members and things like that, or abstracts, how those are named will impact then how line items or individual data points are named. So you end up going through this kind of iterative process until you come up with the best taxonomy, the best structure for all of the elements that are going to make up that taxonomy. And then presumably we go through some sort of an approval process. And I think it's important to note that, as an organization, we don't have any grand authority on this. It's just that we see ourselves as a clearing spot, a place to help and promote XBRL. And then in the end, on the right side, once you have something published, we've got software developers, people who are preparing data, the consumers, and then, of course, the governing bodies, whoever creates this, those organizations that run through the revision cycles and whatnot. So chapter 2 really discusses this from the standpoint, hey, you're doing the style guide. How does that fit into this grand picture, and how should I be thinking about the way that these rules are used? So the first set of rules goes into general language considerations, and that applies to concepts, labels, and documentation. And really, in the summary, what we do is we throw a lot of examples in, and also then basic rules, and we follow RFC 2119, I want to call it, and that is from the IETF, which basically says what may and shall and may not and whatnot actually means. And we're trying to be as consistent as possible with industry terms. And we use that throughout. Let me pop back to the document for a moment and show you that. So you see here nouns. Each item in the taxonomy vernacular should contain a noun. So this is actually a reference down to 2119 and what that means. So should means you really should be doing this. We're not saying you must. So it's kind of the second highest level of recommendation. And you'll see here must not and should not. So and again, those are defined in 2119. So we'll talk about how adjectives, articles, nouns, pronouns, all those things should be used, spelling and alternative terms, scaling and units. And this is actually one of these kind of traps that you can get into. And it's easy, particularly if you're coming in fresh from a different perspective. You haven't been dealing with any of the taxonomies we have right now, and start thinking, well, I want to represent the name of a concept and call it millions of barrels of oil or something like that. So you need to be very careful about using scales. In that case, we got both scaling and units put in there, because those things are actually handled in other places within XBRL. And there are some times when you've got terms of art in an industry where it may make sense to do that, and we discuss that within the document. The second part then goes specifically into concepts or element names. I myself have been using element names as kind of the general term for the past 10 years, but you know, when you get into inline XBRL, they're not element names, they are names, and they're concept names. And that the idea of elements applying to XML makes a lot of sense, but when we're talking about the taxonomy items, there really are concept names. So basically what we're doing is we're presenting some basic rules for the naming, and in the summary, it's kind of common concepts. And this is where you're going to have a lot of inconsistency going forward, and we recognize that, because when you import taxonomies, you're going to be importing all the good stuff and all the baggage too. And there may be cases where you're just, let's say we're going to take in, let's take UGT. I'm going to pull in close to 20,000 concepts, and I'm going to start adding maybe 200. I may want to really align myself with the way that those things are being done in particular presentations and whatnot, and violate the rules that we put out here, just simply for the sake of consistency. On the other hand, if I'm building a whole nother set of things, I may want to deviate and become consistent with what we're promoting here. Then we talk about organization, word ordering. This is something that we actually had a lot of discussion about with word ordering, and you just look at in UGTs, there's a lot of different ways that things are ordered, like the way assets are represented, and whether they're current or not current, and how that gets put together in the concept name. And sometimes they're ordered one way or another way, and this again is seeking consistency. And there are different vectors that push on, or forces that push on this word ordering. It's really neat to have element names that kind of line up when you sort them. But on the other hand, they don't start making too much sense when you just read them out loud if they're out of natural language order. So we discussed naming rules, we discussed types, data types, and this is an area that we're kind of in flux with. We included tuples, or tuples, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and with the idea that if people want to use that, they then can. And there's been some feedback already basically saying, hey, we're trying to dissuade folks from using tuples. So I guess we'd like to hear from people out there whether or not we should dissuade the use of them. And that's in favor of type dimensions. And this tends to get a little bit more complicated. Maybe it's something that we can actually have a separate discussion on at a later time. But you'll see in here there's a few paragraphs about this and how to use the naming of it. And if you're here and you're primarily SEC oriented, you're not going to have any idea what these things are. And as that applies, again, too, because part of UGT or US GAAP taxonomy, that this is not as part of that. So the fifth part then is actually looking at labels. And to be clear, when we're talking about a label, that is one of a dozen or more roles that are standard defined, that define what a concept actually is. So we talk a little bit about those roles. We discuss the language usage, capitalization, how to use hyphens and things like that. And if you look at the different roles for a particular concept, that concept may have a role that is going to be your standard. It may have a negated role or a total role. And those are the things where you're going to actually have labels that are created for those things, and how to actually generate the language for that. The final big role then is the documentation label. And that doesn't really follow the same rules, because many times you're looking at pulling out a segment of text from some rule or some generated requirement somewhere that this particular data point applies to. So this is the idea behind this, is what makes this data point valid. it defines a particular thing. It references back to a particular rule. We want this data because of X. When you're assembling the data that goes into that data point, what are the rules that apply to that? So this is that deep level of what applies to that fact or that particular item. And then finally, we have references, which is then the formal aspect of referencing within XBRL to basically what supports that. And we also discussed their version control and deprecating items, in other words, making them obsolete over time.
Scott, do we have time to take some questions?
Sure.
Excuse me. Sorry to interrupt with the cough, but we've gotten some questions in, and this might be a good breaking point since you've outlined what's included so far. The first question that we received is, should filers update their existing extension elements if they don't adhere to the naming rules in the style guide?
I'm going to have Campbell jump in this after I get done here. I would say at this juncture, no. The UGT, or the US GAAP taxonomy, we don't govern that, and it should follow the SEC guidelines and what FASB lays down.
Yeah, and the labels that you use in those elements are going to reflect what you have in your filing. That's under the EFM rule. So no, this wouldn't. If you're an extension, if you have an extension taxonomy that you're filing for the SEC, these rules would become, if you were to apply them, they do not supersede the rules already laid out by the SEC. Those should be followed first. These rules predominantly apply to someone who's developing a taxonomy, or a group that's developing a taxonomy, to collect data information. Typically, it may be someone like a regulator or some other in some kind of business purpose who's looking to collect this information.
Yeah, to kind of expand on that too, if you're creating an extension or a custom concept, and it's because you need to have clarification or something doesn't exist in the UGT. So if, let's say that there's 2 items that are already defined and I have a third one, then I don't want them to be ambiguous, so I go through the process of extending. I think you want to follow both the EFM rules, SEC and FASB, but you also want to follow what's in the UGT. So it makes sense to somebody who realizes that in this particular taxonomy, in this presentation structure, I have made an extension, and it's basically a variation on existing items, or an existing item. So I think that would take precedence over the style guide, but where it doesn't, there's a question of it's open, then go ahead and use the style guide.
Thanks, Scott and Campbell. And also just, UGT is another way of saying US GAAP taxonomy, just for those on the call who might not be familiar with that. The next question we got is about the UGT, or the US GAAP taxonomy. And it's, how does the current US GAAP taxonomy, either the 2016 or the 2017 release, match up with the style guide?
I would say pretty well, but there are definitely areas that are inconsistent within UGT itself and that are inconsistent with this. We have not had, there's people from FASB who have been involved that in this process, but I don't think on an official basis. And as time goes on, we're going to be wanting to hear from them, and hopefully hear now too, what their thoughts are on this. And I would hope in running this committee that going forward in the years to come, that we use this as a basis to apply to other taxonomies that already exist as revisions are made. But that being said, there's absolutely no requirement, no intent to say, hey, go back and re-engineer these things because we created this document.
Okay, great. Why don't we've got a couple more questions, but why don't we move ahead, Scott, and we'll take other questions.
Sure. We're actually getting close to the end here. The last part of the style guide is the appendices, and they use the term non-normative. That's kind of the term of art. That basically means that these are things that aren't rules. And basically what we've got in there is the information about the governance and the control of the document. One thing that we want to get at the end that's blank right now is we want to create examples, and we're going to be doing some ourselves at the DSC. And if anybody has any ideas that might apply, that would be really wonderful. And what we're looking to do is either pick an industry or make up some fictitious sector, and then come up with some concepts, labels, and comments as to why those exist. and then review that again against and use the style guide rules. So we can throw an example. Let's just say it's, you know, bicycle tires made out of bubble gum or something. That's a manufacturing sector. If you create particular concepts to do reporting on, maybe inventory or manufacturing progress or whatever the case happens to be, and I make some concepts and some labels, I then throw 3 of them in there. So a picture's worth 1,000 words. If somebody goes to the dependency and looks at it and says, oh yeah, I see how those are being applied now. Because here's an example. So if we can get into that particular appendix, and let me open that up and go to it. It'll be it's at the very end. On 2 or 3 pages in here of those things, I think that's really going to help developers that come in and look and say, hey, I have this particular kind of situation. I'm looking to create these concepts. What does this really mean? How does the style guide fit together? And what are the end results of that? So the next thing here is, what are we really looking for, and what do we want from commenters? Basically areas that aren't included but that should be. So if you see something that's missing, as I mentioned before, we'd like to hear about that. We'd like to suggestions and recommendations made. Maybe we're putting something in here and haven't thought about the impact of it. It could be as simple as, hey, that's a pretty good idea, but maybe it should be, instead of must, it should be should, in terms of the strength of the particular thing. If there's areas that need clarification that aren't clear. And this is actually, we've had quite a bit of debate on a lot of things in here, and when you really start putting some gray matter to what these things mean, you start realizing there's a lot of other facets that need to be addressed. So by having more people involved with this, we can explore that further and hopefully come up with a solid and a good specification. You know, who should comment? Basically, developers, business stakeholders. If you are thinking about or have an idea where XBRL might apply, or if you're thinking about using it inside, or if you currently file and prepare, you know, we're looking for folks like that. You don't have to be a member to comment. This is open to the public. And it can be through individuals or an organization. And it can be any type of an organization. It can be educational, it can be business, it can be NGO, it can be government. We don't really care, we just want the input. And the comment period is going to be open until July 17th. So we're going to assemble all the stuff together then, and then come up with a final on that. And then there is a link that, I don't know, is that available, Michelle, on any place that can be copied?
We can send it out to everybody. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the webcast replay, and then we'll also send them a link to this. But it is posted on our website, yes.
I love how I took my cell phone and turned on all the notifications, and obviously it doesn't listen to me. So it's sitting here dinging out. That's not disturbing people. So we'll do 2 things here. We're going to look at how we can actually make comments and where that page is. And I'm going to hand that over to David, and he'll talk about that in detail. So David, why don't you go ahead and take it?
Sure, thanks, Scott. Let me know when you can see my browser screen.
Okay, we got it.
Great. Homepage of XBRL US. I'll step through this really quickly. There are actually several different ways to get to the document for public review. You can do it online, you can download it and review it offline. So starting from the homepage of our site, if you wait for the carousel, it will eventually come up as the XBRL US Style Guide. Click it, you'll get to the document. Second way, it's a reference guide piece. So if you click this link, reference guide, you'll see it in a list. It will be last under a section called building taxonomies, because the style guide is about building taxonomies. Third is just to put it in search, and it'll come up as a search result. Should come up first. Anyway, any way that you get there, this is the style guide. It's the exact same document that Scott's been touring through as a PDF. It's here in HTML format, and this is actually the preferred way for collecting comments, although I'm sure if you were to email comments to info@xbrl.us or one of the members of the team, we would happily take your comments, so long as you agreed to the terms for commenting, which are at the bottom of the document. There are sections throughout the document where you can either return to the table of contents or comment on this document. We'll just scroll down through so that you can see that there are breaks in the content for getting back to the top or commenting. So if you read through a section and you decide you have a comment to make, you've come to the right place. You'll notice that you have to be logged in to post a comment. So I'll quickly log in here. Then I'm free to comment, so long as I click this link, review and accept these terms and conditions. If you forget and you make a comment, don't worry about it. We'll follow up with you. We'll just say, hey, could you please come through this click through? Terms and conditions. Generally, it's just IP policy that guides most of the documentation that we develop as an organization. This one is specific to the Domain Steering Committee and to this document. At the bottom, my name and also my email address have been entered in already for me. I simply click agree. Let me try that again. I should get a confirmation that I've agreed to the terms and conditions. Close that window, and then I'm free to make a comment. It's as easy as that. Scott, I don't know if there's anything else I can.
Is there any other pending questions, Michelle?
Yes, we have a couple of questions, and again, if people have questions, you can click on the Q&A link and submit your questions. Another question is, how do you join the committee? Someone indicated that they may be interested in participating in ongoing work that the committee is doing. So how are you able to join the committee, and what's the commitment?
You asked Michelle and she put you on the list and you become part of the list. There's basically a couple different levels of participation. Anyone can join in and listen in and talk at any point in time. We have voting and non-voting members. In order to be a voting member, you have to be a member of XBRL US and you have to be in good standing with the committee. That means you need to attend on a regular basis. So if you can't show up and one day and then show up 6 months later and vote, you have to be participating in the process. But other than that, you can come in and listen at any time. They're also recorded, the meetings, and they are available to listen in. We meet on the first Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern of the month. And we also tend to have working group meetings in the middle of the month on Thursdays. During the end of the process of finishing up the style guide, we're meeting pretty much every week for an hour. Usually what we tend to do is go through general discussions on particular items, and then somebody goes and writes a bunch of language, and then we wordsmith it and have more discussions about it until we finalize the sections. The full committee talks about what we're generally doing and then decision making, and then there are certain things that we will end up having votes on, such as whether or not to approve this document for public review. And when we go through the comments, we're going to discuss that in the general meeting and what's going to be accepted, not accepted, what's going to be changed, and eventually have it ratified.
Great. And members or individuals who join have to either be individual members or corporate members. So if you're interested in participating and having a say in the standards that are being developed for taxonomies, this is a really good opportunity to do so. And Scott, what's the next task for the committee? What's the next big project that you're working on once this is finalized?
Actually, even in parallel here now, because we were working on the taxonomy development guide and landed on, hey, we need to finish this, that got suspended. So we're restarting that now. In fact, that's going to be tomorrow's discussion. And we're going to pull both what we call a marketing component, that's the why you should use XBRL, and then the actual development guide is 2 different pieces, and start actually working on it. They're outlined right now. I'd say in the grand scheme of things, the marketing part, the hey, why you should use XBRL is probably about half done, and we're about a quarter done with the development guide. It's mostly an outline form with a little bit of meat on the bones in various places, but there's a lot of writing to do and a lot of organization.
Great, and that's a really important component of the whole taxonomy creation process, is that guide. So that's a good opportunity for anybody who's interested in participating from any stakeholder group. So those are all the questions that we have, Scott.
Okay. Well, I just want to take the opportunity here at the end to thank everybody for participating, and we look forward to having comments come in, and I'm really happy to be at this point. And I don't know if Mr. Campbell wants to add anything in at this juncture. I think he had another commitment and he was kind of hanging out in here.
I was on mute. Sorry, I was just trying to get off mute. Yeah, no, I just want to thank the Domain Steering Committee for all the hard work they've done in getting this document out. It's been a lot of work. So thank you very much to you, Scott, and me.
Oh, and thanks to everybody who's participated. And we look forward to more people and some fresh faces. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and close the meeting.
Yep. Thanks very much, Scott. Thanks, Campbell. And thanks you all for participating. And we hope to see your comments in the style guide. Thank you. Bye now.